The following is a Barrett Sports Media production. We do the digging, so you don't have to.
We've got breaking news.
Breaking news.
Breaking news.
Bringing you the biggest stories from the industry you care about. This is the Media Noise Podcast.
Well, let's hear it.
Now, here's your host, Demetri Ravanos.
Back from vacation, although I guess if you are a listener to this podcast, you know I didn't really get a vacation from the podcast because USC and UCLA had to go and be selfish and force me to record an emergency episode last week. But worry not, we are back to our normal routine this week on Media Noise. Thanks so much for joining me. Danny O'Neill coming up in just a moment to talk about Draymond Green. I contend that he has already gotten boring, and the whole new media thing has already run its course. Danny and I will talk about that. Arky Shea will join me in a bit as well to talk about the late Hank the Hammer Goldberg. Now, which was he? Was he the Hammer or was he Hammer and Hank? We'll probably get into that when Arky joins me. But first, man, what a week for trolling in the world of sports media. Like, I don't think we have seen two more perfect examples than we saw this week. The big one, obviously, was ESPN putting a billboard for The Captain, their 10-part documentary series on Derek Jeter, which I'm sure will be just a laugh a minute, just like Jeter himself, putting a giant billboard for it right outside of Fenway Park. Mwah, beautiful. The other one came on Tuesday after the Nathan's Famous Hot Dog Eating Contest. Pat McAfee responded to a tweet from Peter King in a very fun way on his radio show. King was asked by a follower if he had a pick for who he thought would win the hot dog contest, and Peter King responded with something to the effect of, "I never watch because in a country where 1 out of 5 people go to bed hungry, a hot dog eating contest is disgusting." Okay, he's not wrong, right? Not wrong at all, but it is a little bit of a how dare you kind of attitude. So Pat McAfee on Tuesday comes out swinging by donating 10,000 hot dogs, or I guess promising to donate 10,000 hot dogs as soon as he figures out the logistics, to homeless shelters across America, and says, A, this is in Peter King's name, and B, I'm sure he will follow suit and do this himself very quickly. I mean, it was perfect, and both of these things harken back to the old days of radio wars, something that as a guy that started in rock radio, I truly miss, which was just openly ribbing whether when I say the competition, it could be the brand, their personalities, their listeners, whatever the case may be. But, you know, is it mean-spirited? Yeah, a little bit, but it's also fun. It gets attention. And in the case of Pat McAfee, he was able to make his point and also do a good thing. I think we need more well-thought-out expert trolling in order to bring back the radio wars in a way that is more creative than just, you know, I called your wife fat on air or we slashed your tires at a remote. Both of these required a lot of creativity and a lot of forethought from the people involved. And I think they deserve their kudos today. I think Danny O'Neill and I come down on different sides of Draymond Green. However, Danny, I will tell you, I was not on the I'm getting tired of this side until recently. His new media crusade, holding the quote-unquote old media accountable, I was not opposed to that until I started to realize I think this is the only thing the guy can do.
You think that might be his one trick? He's a specialist.
Yeah. So I was thinking about this. I mean, it was sometime last week while I was on a plane. I cannot remember what the impetus for this was, but it dawned on me for all the talk of, oh, this is the heir apparent to Charles Barkley. I think his ceiling, broadcasting wise, I think his ceiling is more akin to Magic Johnson.
That's harsh. Magic. It's an assault and a takedown on. Magic is just sunshine and rainbows, right?
Sure,
he's like all things. Like he generally doesn't express firm opinions. Like I feel like he just wants to talk about like his life is being Magic Johnson, like Mr.
Right.
Happy. I think there's some merit to what you're saying. The idea that Draymond, the majority of his new media content is actually criticism of old media.
Yeah.
I think that's true. And if that is the case, and if that's all he's going to have, then his ceiling is much lower than I think. I think he has more than that. But we'll see. He's in a very strange spot right now in that he is still an active player, and we're seeing more active players become active media members. Greg Olson did it a couple years ago. Like, he was hurt and then ended up doing Fox telecasts where he was the color commentator. And it is a different dynamic because players are generally, even when they're hostile toward their peers in the course of a game, are reluctant to be that way publicly. And that is part of the job. Like, Draymond Green is going to have to criticize other basketball players for how they do if it's going to work in the media, because you can't just be a mutual admiration society.
So that is one of the things that I think Draymond's I guess just his rise in star power as a media member has begat that I'm really concerned about how long or how much runway there is for this whole new media thing, is that there seems to be a real divide now, and guys like Kendrick Perkins, who have really had no trouble being critical of current players, have really worked on the craft, seem to be ostracized from this group of, you know, Draymond Green, CJ McCollum, Patrick Beverley, these guys that are still active and view whatever broadcasting contributions they have as the only valid broadcasting contributions.
But as hosts, isn't that a great trait? Like, as if you're looking at them, to feel that they've got the only way of doing it.
I mean, Danny, if I could cut you off here, is it a great trait if they're not good?
Oh, I think you don't think Draymond Green or CJ McCollum or Patrick Beverley are good?
I think they're fine.
Because I think that they do bring a perspective to it that is unique. And I don't mind the fact that Draymond says you can only criticize basketball by talking about how the game is played. Like, you have to root, because basically Draymond's point is, I don't want to hear Skip Bayless saying Steph Curry's legacy was diminished last night if he can't tell me why Steph Curry failed from a basketball standpoint.
So I understand that point of view, and if Draymond Green could, say, have a second pitch in his arsenal, I would be all with you. I think that when I hear that, what I hear is, don't talk to me unless you've had your hand in the dirt. And to me, that is really far away from being an entertaining character on television, radio, whatever. And that's really important. And I wonder if this new media group gets that.
I think that what will determine whether the approach is successful or not is whether Draymond Green can criticize someone else who puts their hand in the dirt. I don't think it will depend on his ability to cooperate and play the role of former player as it's currently played in media, right? Like, I don't think he needs to ever, if I hosted or was a media figure that he was interacting with, I don't think he ever needs to give my opinion credence. I think that what will determine whether he's successful is, does he use his toolbox that he's described of, hey, we talk about the game of basketball and basketball is beautiful, to explain why someone like Karl Anthony Towns, who he is fairly and has been kind of critical of, can he use that toolbox to criticize another player? Can he do that? That's what I think will determine it, because when he does that, he's going to piss off that player, and then he's going to have a different foil. Draymond, his brand, I believe, is going to be fueled by conflict. And that can work. Skip Bayless's brand is fueled by conflict.
Sure.
That's what it's based upon. And I don't think it's whether or not Draymond will develop a more inclusive sort of sense of what media can be. I think it's going to be, does he use his own perspective? Does he use what he's describing as his framework to criticize other people? That's what I think will determine whether or not. And I don't know, because for the most part, what he does is he uses his framework to criticize people who don't have the expertise he does. And look, if I was a program director, I think what Draymond Green is saying, like his thought process, he would be a terrible program director. I think I think he is a good host because he's got a very firm sense of what matters to him.
I think he's got the tools to get there. I will give you that. I guess let's wrap up here, because this is something that I think the whole new media thing outside of Draymond, I wonder how sustainable it is, because Draymond has developed, even in his basketball career, that adversarial, everything is about conflict personality. I don't know that it works for Patrick Beverley and CJ McCollum as media personalities.
Yeah, I'm less convinced of Beverley. I like CJ McCollum. I really like JJ Redick. Like, of those guys, I think that McCollum and Redick specifically can both pay it off. Beverley was just grinding an axe.
Sure.
Like, that's Beverley's impact was he doesn't like Chris Paul, and so he used his right. Like it was a vendetta, and vendettas are not a sustainable media approach.
Hank Goldberg, undeniably a legend of South Florida sports radio, passed away on the 4th of July. Arky Shea is joining me now. Arky, I think that most people outside of South Florida, most of us were first exposed to the guy on ESPN. You are a sports gambling kind of man. Was Hank Goldberg sort of your first national, I guess, mainstream media exposure to someone talking about gambling on TV?
I think you would have to say he was for me, at least for my generation. Brent Musburger, I didn't know for a long time that Brent Musburger was doing the "You Are Looking Live" references to sort of toss little nods and winks out to the gambling community. It was probably Hank Goldberg, and it was vastly because of horse racing, because you would see him at these horse racing parks and these tracks, and he would just sort of give you these really fast, detailed descriptions of these horses. It's something I never sort of got anywhere else. And that was the first time I think I was sort of introduced to the discussion of gambling in a widespread area, because no one in my life, in my circle, ever talked about it. Yeah, he was the only one given the leash to sort of even bring it up. It wasn't until the last couple of years that ESPN started scrolling lines across the bottom of the screen. And when, Chris Felica was doing stuff for College Game Day, still years and years after what Hank Goldberg was talking about with the NFL Countdown, Swami with Chris Berman, and then it's horse racing. It was a really unique time when you think about how the proliferation of sports gambling has gone in the last handful of years versus the taboo thing it was, in the darks not long before that.
Let's talk about the news story we put up of Dan Le Batard sort of reacting to the death of Hank Goldberg. He acknowledged that there is no Dan Le Batard show without Hank Goldberg. Totally coincidental timing that Steven Strom's podcast with Stu Gatz, where he detailed just how important Hank Goldberg was in his career, had just gone up right before Goldberg died. But, Le Batard made it clear this show does not exist without Hank Goldberg, but I think Hank Goldberg is an absolute asshole.
Yeah, his words, not yours. His words, absolutely. Yeah, and I think what's so fascinating about someone like a Hank Goldberg is that a lot of that sort of makes sense with some of the stories I sort of heard behind the scenes, right? I know people who've done radio hits with him and stuff before, and they know that he's very short and terse, and if he's going to do the hit with you, sometimes it's going to be short, sometimes, during the hit itself, he's going to be sort of a jerk during it. But like he was one of these guys that I think it was his personality, right, to sort of be a little abrasive, so to speak. And I think it's probably what made him such an icon when it comes to especially radio down in Miami with what was his longtime tenure WQAM, is that it was because he was such an abrasive fella to callers, to listeners, and to guests, and to a lot of people, and included to Dan Le Batard that sort of, spurned. It was actually Dan Le Batard, his columns that got to Hank Goldberg that got Dan Le Batard on the radio, which is always sort of fascinating to think about how that all worked if Hank Goldberg had just not cared,
Yeah. I mean, I think that one of the things that I thought about listening to that segment on the Le Batard show is not necessarily about Goldberg and Le Batard individually. It is more about that era of radio. And Le Batard made the point that it was that era of radio in South Florida, but I think that is tunnel vision, man. I mean, you are talking about the late 90s, early 2000s, the heyday in New York of Opie and Anthony, probably the Stern Show, the biggest it ever was at that point. Like, mean radio was a thing back then. And, we look back on some of that stuff now, and whatever you want to call it, man, cancel culture, Me Too, whatever the case is, that stuff doesn't fly anymore. But I also think a big part of why it doesn't fly anymore is, I think, and I give our listeners a lot of credit, I think our listeners have a lot of options, and I think that has made them smarter. Like, I don't think anybody believes that people behave like that anymore, and they are looking for something more authentic than they might have been 20 years ago.
I think that's fair, because just as easily as you could have found someone like a Hank Goldberg, if you didn't like it, you can go find 1,000 other options, right, of stuff to listen to. And now even to listen to people talk about the Dolphins, like Hank Goldberg sort of rested his laurels on. I don't mean that in a negative sense. It's just that's how he became sort of to great prominence with Miami and with the television networks, and hell, with Larry King and company. Like, he became, as I think it was Stugatz that said on that podcast they did, like, he became a big shot there. I think that was Dan Le Batard that said it. But yeah, like, I think that mean radio is something that even in the markets that tolerate it the most, like the New Yorks, the Bostons, the Miamis a little bit, I think you've seen a giant shift where, like, the mean can be tolerated still. And I think listeners still like it to a degree, but I think it has to be in much smaller doses and much less sort of in your face abrasive. Like, I think the great story that was told on that podcast, real quick, and I'll be quick with it. I think Stugatz mentioned that during a phone call, when Stugatz was the producer for Hank Goldberg didn't like a caller's opinion so much that he asked where the caller was, told him to drive into a phone pole, and then tell him where that phone pole, the telephone pole was, so he could come over there and sort of have the last images that caller see
before he died, by the way. But that was part of Hank Goldberg's thing, was not the last images you see before you die.
Oh, yes. Before he died from that injury you just sustained, because Hank Goldberg told you to sustain those injuries, was of Hank Goldberg's testicles. I'm not sure that gets around on a lot of radio now, to be honest with you.
All right, that's where things end this week. Thank you so much to Danny and Arky for taking the time. Don't forget, on Monday, a brand new show joins the BSM Podcast Network family, Seller to Seller, with our pal Jeff Caves. He will be talking about everything on the business and sales side of the media industry. You do not want to miss it. You can go ahead and subscribe to it on all the platforms right now. It's called Seller to Seller, featuring our buddy Jeff Caves. Enjoy, everybody.